sharing. Moving on, I'm recording. Thank you. So today we're going to go ahead and try to finish up ecology, and we've only spent a very short amount of time. Hopefully you did your work the last couple days and you completed your project. So there were some terms that we should make sure we understand before you take the test in just a few days now. What'd you say? Oh, thank you. So there's just a few things we need to go over to make sure that you understand. And some of this stuff, as I said, you've already covered in elementary school. But everyone should know that most of life on Earth gets its energy from the sun through photosynthesis. We've covered that earlier in the year. So 100% of the energy for this life on the surface of the Earth with some exceptions. Comes from the sun. So that's all you got is 100%. The group that captures that 100% or a percentage of that 100% is called what? Yeah, they are plants, that's correct. And some bacteria, right? So they're plants, mostly they're plants on the surface of the earth. But there's also cyanobacteria. Single-celled organisms that do photosynthesis. And some protozoans, some of these things called algae. Right? So they all do. What are all of these called? Yeah, that's right. Somebody remembers. Good. These are called producers. Producers capture 10%. They can capture 10% of the sun's energy. And every time you move, this is called a trophic level. This is the producers. This is called a trophic level. Levels of processing of energy. So this is a trophic level. There's producers. Then what comes, could you close the door, please? And you'll have to get up and open the door repeatedly, so you might want to sit over there by that table, because they're not going to stop coming late. So the producers are, what comes after producers? Consumers. What kind of consumers? Animals? Well, no, yeah, they would be animals, but what do we call, there are different levels of consumers. You're right, they're consumers. And you're right that those are animals. Mostly animals. They could be bacteria. Mostly they're not fungi, mostly, but some might be fungi. Yeah, question or answer? Yeah, they only eat plants. Herbivores is one word for them, right? So I'm just going to put in parentheses, herbivores. What's another word for an herbivore that? So we call them primary consumer. So you're right, they're herbivores. They're herbivores. So that's a primary consumer. By the way, 90% 90% of the energy from the sun is lost to heat. Heat is wasted energy, energy that's not being used. Only 10% is captured by the plants. What percentage of the plant's energy do the primary consumers get, do you think? So the energy from the plants is going to the primary consumer, correct? What percentage do you think is going to the primary consumer? Make a guess. No. 10%. 10% of what the producers got goes into the primary consumer. Then what is next after the primary consumer? Carnivores, right? So these are carnivores. And those of you that know Spanish, carnivore, the words for in Spanish for meat is carne. So vor is eat. So meat eater.
You said carne?
Sorry, carne. All right, so what would you call these carnivores that eat the primary consumers? Secondary consumers, that's correct. Is this coming to you? Do you remember this? And these are carnivores, and usually animals. What do we call, what percentage do you think of that energy of this primary consumers gets into the secondary consumer? 10%. At each stage, you only capture 10%. Where does 90% of that energy get lost to? Heat. %90 gets lost at each stage to heat. And then, obviously, there's what? It's called tertiary consumers. Right. Everybody get that? Yeah? Now we're leaving one group out of this. You don't see that eats all of them. Oh. Huh? What's the one that, omnivores would eat throughout, like humans eat throughout this whole all these trophic levels, but there's something that's going to eat everything. Eventually. Yeah, bacteria and fungi, what do we call them? Say that again. They are prokaryotes. Bacteria are prokaryotes. Fungi are eukaryotes. But good. Yeah, you're right. Bacteria are prokaryotes. But fungi are eukaryotes. But what are they? What do we call these things? Why do we say they're going to eat everything? Not parasites. They not what's left over. Decomposers. That's right. These are all words you've heard before. So decomposers eat dead things. Another word for them, by the way, just another vocabulary word you might see. It's not a big deal if you don't remember it. Detrivore. But decomposers, they eat everything that dies, and since everything dies, they're going to eat bacteria and fungi who eventually will eat everything. And that's the trophic levels, that's it. Like, that's all there is to it. Every time all the energy that we have on this. Now, there are other, instead of plants and using photosynthesis, there are some organisms that use chemosynthesis. And you should know that. That's just a by the way. It's not, it's just an alternative way of getting energy that doesn't have anything to do with the sun. Usually it's at volcanic vents or near this, in the crust of the earth. It's not most of the energy on it. Very difficult to get energy in these other ways. On planet Earth, for all intents and purposes, most of of life depends on the sun. Are we all good with this? So continuing our discussion of energy. So just remember 10%. Every time you change, it's 10% of the total. So plants get 10% of the sun's 100%. The primary consumers get 10% of that. And when I say 10% of, what do? Math students? Multiply. So 100 times 10%, which is 0.1, equals what? 10. And then 10 times 0.1 is what? 1. And that would be your primary consumer. And this is your producer. And then 10% of 1 is 10%. That's your secondary consumer. And then 10% of 0.1 is 0.01. And that's your tertiary consumer. So of the sun's energy, the tertiary consumer, the hawk, the lion, right? That's the third one to get to the meal, to the energy. They only get 0.01% of the sun's energy. I hope you see that that's why eating corn would save us a lot, because we would get 1 unit of energy versus getting 0.01 unit of energy. We would save 100 times the amount of all the resources required to make a cow. So that includes land and water and et cetera. This is why earlier in the year, our visitor talked to you and said eating cows is very wasteful for water and land because of this factor of 10. All right. Now there's this thing called food web. So you can put all kinds of things, and I'm sure they'll give you a food web of some kind, a hawk, and then you can put, I don't know, what would you say, a mouse? I'm not going to draw it. A cricket. What else? A cat. What else? A worm. And maybe a grass. All right. Well, what is going to eat the grass? The cricket. So you draw the arrow in the direction where the energy is going to flow. So where's the head of the arrow going to point? To the cricket. Then what eats the cricket? Oh, by the way, what does a worm eat? Well, let's just say they eat grass. Some worms do, not earthworms. Earthworms just use the humus in the soil. But there are some. Let's put worms in quotation marks. Right. So what eats the cricket? The mouse eats the cricket. So an arrow goes to the mouse. The mouse also will eat worms. And a cat eats the mouse. And what does a hawk eat? It eats the cat eats the cat and the mouse. And actually, depending on the size of the hawk, the cricket too. Well, except the worm. I'm not sure if they'd eat a worm. But they won't eat grass. Yeah, they're tertiary consumers, right? So your producer is here. Oops. Your producer is here. It's in green. Then primary consumer would be the cricket and the worm. And the secondary consumer would be the mouse and the cat, or the mouse. And the tertiary consumer would be the cat, because it's eating the mouse. And honestly, it depending on what it's eating, this could be tertiary or quaternary, but let's just say it's tertiary. Okay? So that's a food web. Arrows go towards what's being eaten, that's all. Towards where the energy's going. You're drawing where the energy's going. 10% every time you eat something, you're only getting 10% of the energy that's in it. The rest is lost to heat. All right. Now you looked at wolves. And you looked at their impact on two organisms, bison and elks. And you looked at a bunch of different factors with the wolves. You were supposed to come up, they talked about a trophic cascade, and they talked about carrying capacity, and they talked about intraspecific and intra and interspecific competition. And then they talked about density dependent and density independent factors. And then they talked about something called keystone. Who can tell me what a keystone species is? Well, let me rephrase this. Let me ask the question differently. Which of those bullet points on page 6 can you tell me? I'll give you a few minutes to think about it and look at your work. Consider this an oral quiz. I'll pause it here and wait for you to answer. Let me just start recording. So you mentioned keystone species. And you say it's an important species, right? I'm going to put bullet points to what words you said. Important. And you say it helps regulate the ecosystem. Hold on. Give me a second. Yeah. Say again? That's right. Without them, the entire system is disrupted. And it looks completely different. All right. So in a keystone species, without them, the entire ecosystem changes. Yeah.
Don't they hunt unwanted animals?
I wouldn't say unwanted. It's a good point, though. I like the way you're saying they do hunt. In fact, this is actually very much related to this idea of trophic cascade. Keystone species don't have to be predators. In the example that we just used in the wolf study, the wolves are keystone species. They are predators, and they're involved in something called a trophic cascade. And a trophic cascade is just simply being able to limit the population of a secondary consumer, which then impacts the ecosystem in a positive way usually. And we'll look at an example. We're going to look at the wolf example in a second. Yeah. I like to get away from elk and bison because those are things that we don't see in this area. I'm going to use an example of deer because that's something we all see for the most part around here. And then we're going to go ahead and attach this idea of food web and density dependent versus density independent factors. What are some examples, do you think, of density dependent versus density independent factors? Anything? Waiting. Let me pause it. Give you guys. Right? I know it seems like a simple answer, but that's right. All right. So let's talk first, I guess, what is density? So density, when they talk about density, they're talking about, just like any use of the word density in physics and in anything, it's how much or how many in a given space, right? So if you have 1 million people in a building, that's really dense, right? If you have, or let's say 1 million people in a city, that's pretty dense. If you have 1 million people in a state, that's not so dense, right? So the bigger this, it's the how many divided by the space. Okay? And what are some examples of density? And we're talking about density of population. Now, density of mass is how much mass in a given volume. But when we're talking about populations and ecology, density dependent, density independent are how many are the population. Well, the population in a space, right? So what are some things that would be dependent on how many individuals you have in a space? And what would be things that would not depend on that? Say that. Natural selection would be population dependent, I guess you could say. Right, so that density dependent. I think that. Well, hold on. Let's not jump. I like the excitement. I love it. Let's not lose it. But what would be an example of a factor that's not that's density independent? Because most things are density dependent. Most things are density dependent. But what are some things that are not density dependent or density independent? Well, that would be something like an earthquake. That would be something like, I don't know, a flood, hurricane. How many people you have in a space is not going to impact a hurricane. It's happening. A tornado. So anything that's like, it happens, and it's going to happen whether you have a lot of individuals living in that space or not. It's not important to whether it happens or not. Let me pause. Huh? Yes. So earthquake, flood, hurricanes, they're going to happen whether you have 1 million people or 2 people, right? You're going to get an earthquake, you're going to get an earthquake. Now, resources like fresh water, food, right? What are they? Density dependent. The more individuals you have, the less food, the less water. Yeah. Yes, excellent. Good call. Pollution, when it comes to humans, is going to be density dependent. We have about 1 million plus people in the Cleveland area, metro area. Do you have any idea how much poop we produce? NP? A lot. A lot. We have to process that, and that's going to bring us to our last point for ecology that we're going to be able to cover, and that's something called eutrophic. Well, we'll see in a second. But pollution is definitely one of them, all right? Resources, disease. Disease is density dependent, isn't it? You know that. When we had COVID, what did we do? What was the first thing we did when we had COVID? What was the second or third thing we did? Quarantine. Why did we quarantine? Stop spreading it, because the more dense our population, the closer we got to each other, the more we're able to spread the disease. It's just a simple idea. People got upset, but it's a simple idea. If we can stop the spread of disease by reducing the density of the population. All right? So that is density dependent and independent factors. Keystone species, and and trophic cascade. So when you looked at a wolf, the wolf normally, a wolf pack would normally eat deer. Would normally eat deer. Of course, deer, oops, I drew the arrow in the wrong way, didn't I? The wolf would eat deer. The deer would eat grass. Let's just say, let's not put let's say plants, because they don't eat grass, unfortunately. The same plants that rabbits eat. The same plants that, I don't know, what else? Probably squirrels, because they eat a lot of seeds. The same plants that squirrels eat. And they eat a variety. They eat a variety of plants. And so there's a lot of different organisms that depend on those same plants. So what we did, I don't even know how long ago, is we got rid of the wolves because we didn't want them attacking our children and our small dogs and cats. And so we got rid of them. We killed them all in this area. And so what happened to the deer population? It increased. It increased every year since then. It's gotten to the point where they're everywhere. They're so dense. They're so dense. The population is so dense that there's disease. It's called, there's a wasting disease that's going around among their population. They've reduced the diversity. They've reduced the diversity of plants and the amount of plants available. Which led to a decrease in the rabbit and other organisms that ate that food. So what you had was you had a wolf that was controlling the deer population, trophic levels, right? Controlling the deer population. But when you got rid of the wolf, the deer population got out of control, which then devastated the plants, which devastated all the other organisms that depended on the plants. So the whole ecosystem was impacted. So it turns out that the wolf was a keystone species. Because it, through a trophic cascade, was able to control, to stabilize through what we call, remember, negative feedback? By using negative feedback, we're able to regulate and continuously have homeostasis in the environment. But since we got rid of the wolf, that negative feedback's gone, and what you had was a devastating impact on the diversity. What we've done is we've taken the place of the wolf in the Solon area and in other places where we have hunters that take the place of the wolf. So artificially we regulate this. Some people argue reintroduce the wolves. We've successfully done it in other places in the country. We've reintroduced wolf packs, and they have controlled the deer population and elk populations, et cetera, and they've reestablished diversity. It's called biodiversity. Like all things, the more diverse a population is, the healthier the population, the healthier the ecosystem. Exactly what we discussed in the past about evolution. If everything's the same, if you only have one kind of anything, what happens to one happens to all. So you want to have diversity so that when tragedies occur, when natural disasters occur, because they will occur, that's without a doubt, some of the population will survive. That's the point. So, all right. So that's biodiversity, that's keystone species. Now let's talk a little bit about pollution. I'm going to depend on you to know something about carbon, about global climate change. You know that it's increasing CO2 concentrations and methane concentrations. That's methane. In the air, these are global climate change gases. This is causing an issue across the world, rising of the ocean levels, the South Pole glaciers are melting. So there's some stuff that I hope that you've been paying attention, because we just don't have time to cover it before your exam. It's sad because it's obviously one of the more important issues that are occurring in your life. We'll cover it, but we're going to have to wait till after the exam. So that being said, there is something else that we should talk about. Another major issue that's happening in the ecosystem that you're inheriting. I'm going to go ahead and put a circle around this one. There is another one, and another issue that you're dealing with is habitat loss. The Amazon being destroyed is a really good example of habitat loss. But building parking lots, tearing down forests to build cities, expanding urban sprawl versus building up versus renewing the city, the inner city. Anytime you're sprawling, you're spreading out, organisms are losing habitat, which is why the deer are in your backyard. The deer are not in your backyard. Your backyard is in the deer's home. It was their habitat first. We took it. All right. So that being said, it is what it is. So that's habitat loss. That's a big issue. Of course, we're polluting, and one of the big sources of pollution is poop and pee, but I'm just going to go ahead and just say poop, if that's all right. It sounds funny, so it's just, kids don't like to talk about poop. I don't mind talking about poop. You know that. But if you consider every one of you poops multiple times a day, where does all that poop go? Eventually. It used to go directly in the lake sometimes, especially after a storm. Hopefully not anymore. We're cleaning it. this has led to cholera epidemics throughout history. If you ever seen in India, they have the Hindi festival where they go into the it's that big Ganges. Is it Ganges? The Ganges River. Is it? How do you pronounce it?
Gandhi River.
What is it? Gandhi? Is it Gandhi? Is that how you say?
You mean Ganga?
I don't know. The big river where all the there's a Hindu festival where they all go in the river and cleanse themselves,
Yeah.
right, once a year, right? That river is full of poop. People get sick, right? Yeah, it's a issue. Now, pee and poop has to go somewhere, and normally the ecosystem takes care of it because you have bacteria. Bacteria is a good thing. I know we all think bacteria is bad, but bacteria is actually a very good thing because they eat, bacteria and fungi eat the poop, and then out on the other side, what you make is it breaks it down to nitrates and nitrites. All right. Now, nitrates are plant food, plant nutrition. They're a source of nitrogen. It's a very important element that you cannot get any other way. Nitrogen comes from the soil. There's a lot of nitrogen in the air. Most of the air is nitrogen, but nothing can use it. Nothing can use the nitrogen in the air except for some bacteria. Bacteria are essential to life on planet Earth. Without bacteria, we lose all our nitrogen. It goes right back into the air and we can't capture it again. Bacteria remember the fixing of CO2 by plants? The bacteria fix nitrogen into the soil. That nitrogen fixing is part of this as well. So nitrogen, N2 gas in the air gets fixed by bacteria. And it gets turned into nitrates and nitrites. That's in the soil. That's why plants have roots. That's why they need roots. They're not just water. Plants get water from this from the soil, but they also get nitrogen from the soil. So nitrogen, and another one they get is potassium. Another important nutritional element that they need. And the last is phosphorus. Obviously, plants need nitrogen to make amino acids and DNA and RNA. Obviously, they need phosphorus to make DNA and RNA. And potassium is necessary as well. So plants need this. And in fact, fertilizer is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So when you hear fertilizer, they say plant food. What they really mean is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Plants actually make their own food. That's right. But in the store, you'll see plant food, but what they really mean is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the three elements. Now, some plants need more than others, etc. Now, when we poop in the water, or when people do, and in combined sewers in Cleveland, we have what's called a combined sewer. So that means that the poop you flush down the toilet goes into a special pipe, and the water from the rain goes into a different pipe, but they all combine into one pipe. They stay separate unless the rain gets heavy. Under real bad thunderstorms, real bad rain, the water mixes, and all the poop that people are flushing gets dumped into the shaker lakes and into Great Lake, into Lake Erie, into the rivers, and you get all that poop going out to the. In fact, after a big storm, you'll see on Edgewater, Huntington Beach, or whatever, they'll say no swimming. Why? After a storm, why is there no swimming? E. coli. There's poop in the water. After a while, the bacteria will eat the poop and water gets flushed further downstream, so it gets taken care of. We're fixing that. You're paying higher sewer rates in order to fix it. We're digging giant holes and we're cleaning the water now. And get the giant holes are to hold the water after a storm so that we can clean it before we put it in the lake, right? So that's getting corrected, but for many, many years, that was the case. Okay? And in fact, a lot of places it's like that. Chicago now is no longer like that, and Cleveland will soon not be like that as well either. So the other thing that people do is they add fertilizer to their grass, right? And what's fertilizer? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium.
For like gardens, you use cow poop.
Yeah, gardens they'll use cow poop, but what are they really trying to do for gardens and for grass? NPK, right? Fertilizer, whatever, cow poop, doesn't matter. When you add that stuff to the soil and it rains, where does that stuff go? Into the lake. So all that NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, all goes in the lake. Or river, obviously first the river, then the lake. At least I hope it's obvious. First in the river, the creek, and then the river, and then the lake. You get right? Does that make sense? Yeah? So in this river and lake, there are these little organisms called algae. Algae do what? They are producers. They do photosynthesis. And in the lake, of course, you have little fish. And you have little frogs. And I'm not even I can't. Ribbit, they're swimming around in there. Okay, whatever. So they got the fish, you got snails, you got little organisms that live in the lake, rivers and lakes, right? They breathe oxygen. These guys breathe oxygen, including fish, by the way. They breathe oxygen. They use water to get the oxygen out of the water. So as these little fish and snails and other organisms that breathe oxygen in the water, the little algae are making oxygen from the sunlight. All life is good until we start adding too much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Then what happens is that the algae starts to grow like crazy because that's a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There's sunlight, so they form a carpet
The green thing
of green.
on the lake.
On the lakes. I'll show you if I have time today. If not, you guys can look it up. It's called an algae bloom. And that happens on the lake. It happens on the ocean. It happens anywhere you're dumping nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And I don't care if it's human poop or cow poop or artificial fertilizer. If you're polluting the water, the algae is going to love it. They're going to use it. And that sounds like a good thing. It sounds like oxygen should increase in the water. And because you're doing photosynthesis, you start to increase oxygen. That's correct. Except it gets too thick. And the bottom layer, yeah, you found it. You can show people if you like, pass it around. What happens, it gets too thick. And what about the algae that's underneath this top layer? Is it going to get any sunlight? Look at this algae here.
No.
It doesn't get any sunlight because it's below it. So all this dies and falls down. And the fish love it. The snails love it. The bacteria love it. They eat food. And they have a lot of babies, right? Especially the bacteria. They have babies every 20 minutes. They don't have babies. They do binary fission. So they suck out all the what? All the oxygen gets sucked out of the water because all that bacteria is using up the oxygen. And so there's not enough oxygen for the fish. What happens to the fish? They suffocate, they die, and the snails die. And soon the lake is called, we say it's a eutrophic lake, like trophic level. Eutrophic means things are dying. If they're not dead, they're dying. Lake Erie almost died. We polluted it so bad that we almost killed all life in Lake Erie. Isn't that sad? Luckily, we saved it because of regulation. So, by the way, the need for oxygen in this water is called biological oxygen demand. BOD.
The whole thing?
Biological oxygen demand. How much oxygen does the lake, river, or ocean need? Biological oxygen demand. When the oxygen demand is high, then there's intraspecific competition, right? Competition between species for oxygen. The ones that win are bacteria because there's no way to get rid of all those bacteria. So they suck up all the oxygen, and the fish and snails and other organisms that need the oxygen in the lake or river die. So that is called, that is the way eutrophic lakes become eutrophic. Lake Erie has had algae blooms. You can see in Toledo, they had to shut down the water processing plant because the algae bloom was so big, it covered a giant chunk of the lake. And you know that's a big lake, right?
Like, take it out.
The algae clears itself out, assuming you stop putting nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you don't stop the pollution, it's going to continue to get thick, and everything's going to die, except the bacteria, which will continue living. Does that make sense, everybody? That's a lot, but that covers all of it. All right. I think I did. Oh, carrying capacity. Do we have time for carrying capacity?
No.
How much? Is that 2 minutes? I got 2 minutes? No. Then I got enough time. Why is it that the truth is out? Carrying capacity. Oh, you know what? I'll just cover it before you take your test tomorrow. Don't let me forget. It's incredibly important. Not tomorrow. Oh, yeah, tomorrow. Tomorrow's Thursday, right?
What test was it? OST.
Your practice OST that I told you you're taking?
Tomorrow?
You're taking your practice OST tomorrow, not your actual one. Relax.